President Joe Biden's opponents in the US cite the scrapping of the Keystone XL permit when they blame him for soaring fuel prices. When Joe Biden scrapped that permit for the huge Keystone XL pipeline just hours after entering the White House last year, 2021, a death knell seemed to be ringing for Canada's oil sands, by far the largest supplier of foreign oil to the US. The project, which would have carried Alberta's heavy bituminous crude oil to Gulf Coast refineries in Texas, had been opposed for years by environmentalists owing to the oil sands' associated ecological impact and high emissions. Even before the cancellation, big European oil companies, insurers, and some Wall Street investors had started fleeing that sector, a sector that was becoming a villain of the environmental, social, and governance investment movement. Then the COVID-19 pandemic triggered an oil crash that deepened the demand, forcing operators to sack thousands of workers, throttle production, and slash capital spending. Yet, 18 months later, the mood is brightening as surging oil prices start to revive the economy. In Alberta's producers, they were forced to contend with sub-zero oil prices just a couple of years ago. They are now using the windfall from a $100 a barrel crude to repair their balance sheets and beef up the dividends. Production is rising again, so is export capacity. A pipeline system to the Midwest of the US has been expanded, and another to the West Coast is due online next year. Across the province's oil patch, business is brisk. Jason Kenney, Alberta's premier, says Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered a new anxiety about energy security that offers perverse vindication for the province and its controversial oil sands sector. Political hostility is beginning to soften as leaders are mocked by reality, he says. We have been saying all along, we cannot allow some of the world's worst regimes to have a dominant role in global energy markets. Last month, Kenny testified to a US Senate committee hearing about closer cooperation on energy between Canada and its neighbor. Senators, Calgary is a lot closer to Washington than Riyadh, he told the committee. And you don't need the US Navy's Fifth Fleet to patrol the Great Lakes. Until Biden's cancellation, the US leg of the Keystone XL permit last year, Hardisty, Alberta, was where 830,000 barrels of oil a day would have entered the 88 billion Canadian dollar pipeline for shipment to the US Gulf Coast refineries, with the cooking facilities to handle the heavy crude. The town had expected a construction boom. The loss of the permit was a blow to the whole province. Kenny had plowed more than 1 billion Canadian dollars into Keystone XL, a move many said was a failed gamble on the re-election of Donald Trump, who had pledged to get the project built. Lobbyists said the pipeline was essential to underpin oil sands growth. Environmental campaigners wanted to stop it for precisely the same reason. Both sides may be wrong. Oil sands production is rising again, even without Keystone XL, as other pipelines routes are expanded to provide export capacity. One of them, the federally owned Trans Mountain expansion to Canada's Pacific coast, is due by next year after a surge in construction costs. A project adding capacity to Enbridge's network to the US Midwest is already complete. Alex Pobey, chief executive of Cenovus Energy, one of the oil sands largest operators, said the new pipeline capacity had put the industry in pretty good shape for a number of years. Biden's opponents in the US cites the scrapping of the Keystone XL permit when they blame him for soaring fuel prices. Yet, the oil industry itself is not clamoring to revive it. Producers are hardly rushing to plow more money into exploration and production, and investors want their companies to use this year's oil price windfall for beefier dividends, not more production. The era of huge new projects seems to be over. Even Canadian Natural Resources, the sector's most aggressive producer, which raised its planned capital expenditure for 2022 by almost 25%, is committing to invest much less than in the earlier boom years. Spending commitments from other operators are also well shy of peak years. Oil sands capital expenditure ran at about 30 billion Canadian dollars annually before 2014, according to Alberta's energy regulator. It was a period of high crude prices and a rush of inward investment. By 2021, though, the figure was less than 9 billion Canadian dollars. It is not expected to rise above 15 billion Canadian dollars a year in the next decade. Kevin Byrne, head of emissions coordination and chief analyst of Canadian oil markets at S&P Global Commodity Insights, reckons that existing projects currently producing about 3.1 million barrels a day can add about another 500,000 barrels per day by 2030, a rate of growth well below that seen in the US shale sector in recent years. The industry's critics, meanwhile, sense a deeper change afoot in the mentality of the developers, or at least their shareholders, as they begin to contend with the implications of a global energy transition. Alberta's government does not like to talk about the possibility that the demand for the province's oil may fall. Kenny insists oil and gas will remain the mainstay of Alberta's economy, possibly for the next 30 or 40 years. But Canada's Liberal government is taking a different tack under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The government will be very active in looking to drive down demand for oil in the world, according to Jonathan Wilkinson, Canada's Natural Resources Minister, in a recent interview. It is a stance that hews closer to that of the International Energy Agency, which has said global oil consumption must drop 75% to just 24 million barrels per day if the world is to hit its climate goals. That may not leave much room for Canada's high cost, high emissions oil. While oil sands producers aren't on the same path as European supermajors such as BP, which has talked of reducing output and forecasts sharp falls in global fossil fuel demand, their investment stance may reflect that reality, argues Jan Gorski, a director at the Pembina Institute, a clean energy think tank in Alberta. Nobody's going to be building new pipelines, new projects. He says the future is bleak for the product. Thank you very much for watching this video.